In this module, we shall learn about the second method of manufacture, namely glass blowing technique. Is the glass blowing technique. Now, glass blowing technique is another technique apart from the float glass process, which is used for the manufacture of glass, but specially for the production of glass bottles and containers. In this process, the molten glass is first inflated into a bubble. That means it is making use of a very old process which we call as inflation. So the molten glass is inflated into a bubble with the help of a blowpipe, and the glass is then manipulated with the help of a torch, but on a very smaller scale, for producing very precise glassware. A glass blower or a glassmith is an individual who actually blows a glass, whereas the one who manipulates the glass with the help of a torch is known as a lamp worker. Now, this is basically done on a very small scale. Now, the basic thing in the start of this process is that the batch of the glass is mixed and is now ready to be used. So basically, first there is an initial furnace. Inside the furnace there is a pot, which we also call as crucible, and in the process, which we call as charging, the furnace is filled with huge amounts of batch, which is then melted at a very high temperature, that is approximately 2000 degree Fahrenheit or 1100 degrees Celsius. Now, while glass blowing can be done individually, but it is actually done with the help of a team, which is very challenging. Now, when the things are actually ready, that is when the batch is mixed, the furnace is ready with very high temperatures, then the glass blower, the work of the glass blower starts. He actually reaches for his blowpipe. And what is blowpipe? Blowpipe is nothing but an iron or a steel rod which is about 4 feet long. The blowpipe is dipped into the furnace and there comes out the molten glass at the other end. Now, what happens is, once the molten glass is secured, the other end of the pipe is cooled off with a barrel of cold water. Once the blowpiper is ready, he will blow through the tube and starts to create a growing bubble in the glass. Whenever the person is not blowing, the end of the tube is capped so that the hot air remains inside the glass and helps it to retain its shape. Further, more layers of glass can be gathered and added with a gathering iron or by dipping the glass attached to the blowpipe again and again in the batch. Glass blowers often make use of a very large flat surface called a marble to roll and shape the glass. Several tools are further used while working on the process of manufacture of glass container, that is the glass blowing process. You have a block which is a wetted wooden shaping tool. Then there is a bladed tool called a jack. Heat shields and paddles are often employed to shield the blower from extreme heat. The paddles can also double as tools to smooth out hot glass. Tweezers are another tools which are used for manipulating pieces of hot glass.
Glass blowing process. Principle. Glass blowing technique exploits one of the working properties of glass, which was previously unknown to the glass workers, that is, inflation. When a small amount of air is introduced in glass, it results in the expansion of the molten part of glass. This process is known as inflation. The property of inflation is centered on that the atoms in the liquid state of glass are bonded together by strong chemical bonds in a random and disordered fashion. Thus, the molten glass is viscid sufficiently to be blown and progressively hardens due to loss of heat. In order to upsurge the rigidity of the molten glass and to expedite the manner of blowing, a refined change in the composition of glass was done. Fisher and McCrae postulated that the lower concentration of natron, which acts as a flux in the manufacturing of glass, makes the glass stiffer for blowing. When the glass is blown, the thin layers are more viscous than the thick layers because the former layers cool faster than the thick ones. Glass blowing techniques. There are two major methods: free blowing, glass blowing, and mold blowing. Free blowing, glass blowing. Although introduced in the 19th century, this technique is still widely used nowadays for creative purposes. The process of free blowing involves the blowing of short puffs of air into a molten portion of glass called gather. This is coiled at one end of the blowpipe with the consequence of making an elastic skin on the inside of the glass blob that matches the external skin produced by the exclusion of heat from the furnace. The glass worker then inflates the molten glass to a coherent blob and works it into a desired shape. Example: one of the examples of this technique is Portland vase, which is a cameo manufactured during the Roman period. Experimentation was carried out by Goudenrath and Whitehouse with the purpose of reinventing the Portland vase. Mainly, the blue glass needed for the body of the vase was collected on the end of the blowpipe that was consequently immersed in a container having hot white glass. Inflation took place when the glass worker blew the melted glass in to the sphere. The sphere was then stretched or elongated into a vase with a layer of white glass overlying the blue body. Mold blowing. Mold blowing was another glass blowing method which came after the invention of free blowing. A globule of melted glass is put on one end of the blowpipe and inflated into a mold made up of carved metal or wood. Hence, texture and shape of the glass is determined by the formation on the inside of the mold and not on the skill of the worker. Usually, just two types of molds, namely single piece mold and multi piece mold, are used to produce mold blown vessels. The single piece mold permits the finished glass object to be detached in one movement by pulling it up from this mold. It is largely employed to create glassware and effective vessels for storage and transportation. While the multi-piece mold is made in multi-paneled mold segments that join together to develop a more sophisticated surface modeling texture and design. Modern glass blowing technique. The transformation of raw materials into glass takes place around 2400 degree Fahrenheit, that is 1320 degrees Celsius. The glass emits enough heat to appear almost white hot. The glass is then left to fine out, allowing the bubbles to rise out of the mass. And then the working temperature is reduced in the furnace to around 2000 degree Fahrenheit, that is 1090 degrees Celsius. At this stage, the glass appears to be a bright orange color. Though most glass blowing is done between 1600 and 1900 degree Fahrenheit, that is 870, and 1040 degrees Celsius, soda lime glass remains somewhat plastic and workable as low as 1300 degree Fahrenheit, that is 730 degrees Celsius. Annealing is usually done between 700 and 900 degree Fahrenheit, that is 371 and 480 degrees Celsius. Glass blowing involves three furnaces. The first, which contains a crucible of molten glass, is simply referred to as the furnace. The second is called the glory hole and is used to reheat a piece in between steps of working with it. The final furnace is called the lair or annealer and is used to slowly cool the glass over a period of a few hours to a few days, depending on the size of the pieces. This keeps the glass from cracking or shattering due to thermal stress. Historically, all three furnaces were contained in one structure, with a set of progressively cooler chambers for each of the three purposes. Many glass-blowing studios in Mexico and South America still employ this method. Many glass-blowing studios in Mexico and South America still employ this method. The major tools used by a glass blower and the processes are as follows: the blowpipe or blow tube, punty, bench, mower, blocks, jacks, paddles, tweezers, paper, and a variety of shears. Process: the tip of the blowpipe is first preheated, then dipped in the molten glass in the furnace. The molten glass is gathered onto the end of the blowpipe in much the same way that viscous honey is picked up on a honey dipper. This glass is then rolled on the mava, which was traditionally a flat slab of marble, but today is more commonly a fairly thick flat sheet of steel. This process, called mavering, forms a cool skin on the exterior of the molten glass blob and shapes it. Then air is blown into the pipe, creating a bubble. Next, the glass worker can gather more glass over that bubble to create a larger piece. Once a piece has been blown to its approximate final size, the bottom is finalized. Then, the molten glass is attached to a stainless steel or iron rod called a punty for shaping and transferring the hollow piece from the blowpipe to provide an opening and or to finalize the top. Apart from the blowpipe, punty and mava, the use of other major tools is as follows. The bench is the workstation with the place for the glass blower to sit, a place for handheld tools, and two rails on which the punty rides while the glass blower is working on the piece to be prepared. Blocks are ladle-like tools made from water-soaked fruit wood and are used with mava to shape and cool a piece in the early steps of creation. Jacks are tools shaped like large tweezers with two blades and are used for forming shape later in the creation of a piece. Paddles are flat pieces of wood or graphite which are used for creating flat spots such as a bottom. Tweezers are used to pick out details or to pull on the glass. Shear. Two important types, straight and diamond. Straight shears are large bulky scissors for making linear cuts, while diamond shears have diamond-shaped blades, when partially open, used for cutting masses of glasses. Applying patterns and color to the blown glass. There are many ways to apply patterns and color to blown glass, including rolling molten glass in powdered color or larger pieces of colored glass called frit. Complex patterns with great detail can be created through the use of cane, rods of colored glass, and murrine. Rods cut in cross sections to reveal patterns. These pieces of color can be arranged in a pattern on a flat surface and then picked up by rolling a bubble of molten glass over them. One of the most exacting and complicated cane working techniques is reticello, which involves creating two bubbles from cane, each twisted in a different direction, and then combining them and blowing out the final form. A lamp worker, usually operating on a much smaller scale, historically used alcohol lamps and breath or bellows driven air to create a hot flame at a workbench to manipulate preformed glass rods and tubes. These stock materials took from as laboratory glassware, beads, and durable scientific specimens, miniature glass sculpture. The craft, which was raised to an art form in the late 1960s by Hans Godo Frabel, later followed by lampwork artists such as Malone Townsend and Robert Michelson, is still practiced today. The modern lamp worker uses a flame of oxygen and propane or natural gas. The modern torch permits working both the soft glass from the furnace worker and the borosilicate glass low expansion of the scientific glass blower. This later worker may also have multiple headed torches and special lights to help from the glass or fuse quartz used for special projects.
Let us now summarize what we have started in this module. In this module, we have actually studied about the second process of manufacture of glass, which is the glass blowing technique. And there are two most important persons who are involved in this process. They are the glass blower, who actually blows the glass, and a lamp worker, who manipulates the glass on very smaller scales with the help of a torch. The basic process on which the glass blowing technique is actually based is a very old process, which we also call as inflation. This property of inflation is basically based on the fact that the atoms in a liquid state, they are bonded together by very strong chemical bonds in a random, highly random and disordered fashion. This technique is majorly used for manufacture of glass bottles, glass containers, creative glass vase, and glass with very complex patterns. So basically, we have also studied that there are two major types of techniques involved in the manufacture of glass, that is the free blowing and the mold blowing. Both the processes have now been extended to what we call as the modern glass blowing technique. In the modern glass blowing technique, the transformation of raw materials into glass takes place again at very high temperatures, that is 2400 degree Fahrenheit or 1320 degrees centigrade. And the glass now emits enough heat to appear almost white hot. Glass blowing technique actually involves three types of furnaces. The first furnace, which is the initial furnace, is also called a crucible furnace, which is nothing but contains molten glass and is simply referred to as the furnace. The second furnace is what we call as the glory hole, and it is used to reheat a piece in between the steps while the technique is going on, the glass blowing technique is going on. The final furnace is what we call as annealer and is usually slowly used to cool the glass. There are many ways now to apply the patterns, different patterns and color to blown glass, including rolling the molten glass in powdered color or larger pieces of colored glass called frit. Complex patterns with great details can be further created through the use of what we call as cane. One of the most complicated cane working technique is reticolo, which involves creating two bubbles from cane, each twisted in a different direction, and then combining them and blowing out the final form.